Our society is not set up to care for these kids and families. And instead of our society feeling shame about that, parents are feeling shame about that. What parents are feeling is, I am trying to exist inside a system that is literally designed for our failure, and then being blamed for that failure, which is traumatic.
Hey, and welcome back to the Calm the Chaos Parenting Podcast. Today, I am so excited because I'm going to be talking with someone where I really believe that we're like peanut butter and jelly. I think we go together so well, and we just happen to be book buddies. We had books come out almost like exact same timing. And the reason I've asked her to come on today is because while we talk about very similar things, we talk about it in very different ways. And so I wanted to kind of pick her brain and ask her about not just raising kids with baffling behaviors and challenging behaviors, but I also wanted to talk about the effect that raising these kids can have on the parents, because I know there can be a lot of guilt and shame around that the parents hold when we're parenting these kids and when we're trying to figure out our kids, we're trying to connect with them and it feels like nothing's working. We can hold a lot of guilt if we have some resentment towards our kids, if we don't actually like the kid that's in front of us. And my guest today is going to be talking about exactly why that happens and what we can do about that. So I am so excited to invite on Robyn. So Robyn, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be a wonderful afternoon.
Yes, I am so excited. We could talk forever as we were talking, forever right before we even hit record. I was like, you know what? Let's just hit record. So Robyn, for people who don't know who you are, can you share just a little bit about yourself? And then also after that, can you share why you're so passionate about helping parents who are raising kids with baffling behaviors?
I am a former play therapist. Even before graduate school, really kind of all the way back to high school. Like these kids with what I would now call super vulnerable nervous systems, the biggest, most baffling behaviors, kids typically with histories of complex trauma has been my clinical area of expertise. I've worked with those kids and those families really essentially always. And for most of my career of 15-ish years, I worked in outpatient therapy setting. I mean, I was a therapist. I saw kids an hour a week, and was a registered play therapist as well. Always did a lot of work with parents, which was sometimes a little unique for play therapists, but I did tons and tons of work with parent and parent support because, well, one, we were doing so much work supporting attachment, because most of the families that I worked with were parenting kids with pretty significant attachment trauma and loss and disruption in their past, but also because parenting these kids is so exceptionally dysregulating that the parents that I worked with needed, of course, just a ton of support on this exceptionally hard parenting journey. So I did that until about 4 years ago when my family and I picked up and moved away from Austin, Texas. We'd been living in Austin for my whole adult life, we lived in Austin. And we decided we needed a change. We headed north, live in Michigan now. And we moved right before the pandemic. So what I thought I was going to do when we moved here and what I actually did when I moved here ended up not being exactly the same. And due to the pandemic, as well as just some stuff in my personal life, I've really shifted in the last 4 years, stepped away from doing outpatient therapy with kids and families. And now I support parents through podcasting, through an online community, through this book that I just wrote. And then I also help professionals know how to support the parents, because I know as much as I do that parents are constantly saying, there's nobody to help us. Or the people that do help us actually end up making things worse because they're not.
Shame.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I feel real passionate about that piece. What I really feel really passionate about is these families. I love their parents. I love these kids. I wish I could work with them all day long, every day. And also, there's just this real stark reality that I can't work with all of them. And there's not enough professionals who know how to support these families in the way that they need supported. So I've kind of split my focus now on supporting families directly and then creating materials and training programs for the professionals so that they feel more confident working with these families.
I love that. And your book is called Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors. And I
Yes.
absolutely love the cover. I love this book so much. So if you are just
Thank you.
listening to this, head on over to the links because you're going to want to see the book in person. It's so beautiful. And it matches all the colors I love so much. But anyway, that's how I knew we were going to be besties.
We do have a similar affinity for this, a similar color scheme for sure.
Yes.
You and I.
Yes. And so before we dive in, I mean, I think anyone who's listening to this podcast or has been listening for a while, they get what I mean when I say big baffling behaviors. But can you just talk a little bit about what you're describing here and what would constitute for a baffling behavior?
Any behavior that parents are saying to themselves, this makes absolutely no sense. Like those dumbfounding, like they're like this like deer in headlights kind of like, what response that parents are maybe not having in the moment. Maybe in the moment they're like freaking out a lot bigger than that. But when they come and talk to me, there is just this confusion. It's a different level than I wasn't prepared for this in parenting. I mean, it's a whole new level, right? It's just like, this makes zero sense. Also, it's like completely unpredictable.
Yeah. So like yesterday, someone in one of our communities posted and they were like, I am dumbfounded. Like what you just said.
Yeah.
My kid was brushing his teeth and the sister came up and just shoved him off of the stool. Unprovoked. Nothing was going on. I don't understand. So that would classify as big baffling behavior, correct?
For sure. I mean, I really think anything that leaves parents, again, in that level of dumbfoundedness, like sometimes it's the unbelievable lying, right? The like, I didn't eat that, cupcake with blue frosting when I have blue frosting smeared all over my face, right? And just this commitment to like, no, I don't even know. No, I didn't do that.
My middle was always like that. He'd come to me with like his haircut, in the front. He'd have no bangs. It's cut all the way down to his skin. And we're like, hey, buddy, did you give yourself a haircut? He's like, no, of course not. And I'm like, really? It just fell off. Like,
it has straight line. Or it's just even lying or behaviors that you're like, that wasn't necessary. Like if you had asked for that, or if you had told me, or if you had just come to me, like the answer would have 100% been yes. Like this huge like fiasco we went through to like get to this point was just like so totally unnecessary. And then because I also have this background in working with kids who have had such significant attachment trauma and loss, those kids also have just such confusing behaviors of like that push pull, right? Like I want nothing to do with you, yet I need you, I need you, I need you, I need you. And this kind of constant, parents are telling me things like, it doesn't matter what I do, it will be wrong. And I'm saying, yes, that is an accurate statement. Like you're not imagining that experience that is the experience of being in a relationship with somebody with really significant attachment trauma. And it's this real stuck. There's no way out. There's no way to get this right. Overwhelm feeling. And so I have a lot of parents that kind of fall in that category as well.
Can you talk a little bit about attachment trauma before we dive too much further? Because I think if you've not dealt with this, then you might not understand it and you might not know what it is. And so you might be like, that's not me. That's not my kid. That's not what's going on here. And so can you just describe what it is and what it, kind of Yeah, just kind of describe
Yeah.
more about attachment trauma so others can understand.
Yeah, I think we can kind of put it into like kind of two different buckets. And one bucket is kids who are probably what come to mind when you think about attachment trauma. Kids who've experienced really serious abuse and neglect. They've, Child Protective Services has been involved. Maybe the child has needed to be placed with another family for their safety. Again, kids who are experiencing abuse, maybe parents who are struggling so significantly with substance abuse or mental illness that kids' needs are going, completely unmet. Like they're not getting fed, they're not in a safe housing,
Mhm.
right? They're very unsupervised. I've worked with kids who have been found walking along a highway at age 2,
Mhm.
right, because of the lack of supervision. And so I think there's this one category of kids whose parents have just really struggled
Mhm.
to provide the safety that
Mhm.
kids need inside the attachment relationship. And what gets so tricky about that is, attachment is this biological imperative. We have an attachment system that we're born with that is designed to bring us towards our attachment figure, especially when we're in danger or unsafe or having a really, really big feeling. So if we're compelled to like go towards our attachment figure when we're unsafe or having a really big feeling, but it's our attachment figure who is creating the experience of lack of safety or unavailable to co-regulate really, really big feelings, that leaves kids stuck in,
Mhm.
I mean, there's this kind of proverbial scrambling of the nervous system as there's this, compulsion to go towards, yet at the same time to go away. And that
Mhm.
creates some stuckness in the nervous system. So I would
Mhm.
call it kind of like the one category of attachment trauma that, generally speaking, is not too hard to articulate or see. Um,
Mhm.
I think we can also look at another category of attachment trauma. And I also want to say up front, when I use the word trauma, that's a relatively neutral word for me. Like, that's not criticism, that's not shaming. It's
Mhm.
just a description of an event. I believe all of us are always doing the best we can, including parents who are struggling to care
Mhm.
for their kids. And what I've also seen over my career is kids who, for whatever reason, are just a little harder to care for. They're a little harder to attune to. Their nervous systems are a little more vulnerable. And, or maybe even they have some medical issues, and
Mhm.
they're having a lot of medical procedures. And so they're left in this more vulnerable state of their nervous system. They're needing some more attunement, some more co regulation. And their caregivers are just confused by them. They're sending cues that don't totally feel like they make sense, or their nervous system is just so sensitive that caregivers are struggling to give like the amount of co-regulation that these kids really need. And that's nobody's fault,
Mhm.
but that sometimes there can just be these, I would say, mismatches. But what I mean by mismatch is like the needs of the child and what the parent has the capacity to give just don't totally match up, like despite
Mhm.
everybody's best intentions. And
Yeah, I was
so,
thinking the word mismatch too when you were like,
yeah,
mismatches. I was like, that's the word that was coming to my mind.
yeah. So those circumstances can unfortunately also leave, a child with kind of that imprint of attachment trauma because
Mhm.
they don't know. Like, my parents doing the very, very best that they can. They really want to care for me and they really want to do a good job. All they know is something feels really bad in my body and nobody's making it stop.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so sometimes, again, to the best of our capacity, there can be some attachment challenges that
Mhm.
are residual.
I think that's really helpful just as kind of a foundation as we go through this conversation. I think having
Yeah.
that talk and being able to talk, I think most people think of that first category when they think of trauma when it comes to attachment. And the
Yeah.
second category is far more common, especially when we're talking about kids that parents that are listening to this podcast are
Yeah.
probably dealing with, right? Is there's that
Yeah.
mismatch and
Yeah.
there's that really sensitive nervous system that's misreading cues or reading the wrong cues or things like that. And then the parents are just, what do I do? Right. And then
Right.
parents are left with, I wasn't raised learning about any of this. And my
Right.
parents definitely didn't understand this either. And so, what am I supposed to do about this? So, before we head into like, what do we do about this? One of the
Yeah.
things that I think is so fascinating that I love that you talk about is the effect this has on the parents themselves. A lot of
Yeah.
times we focus on how do we help the kid? How do we help them feel safe? It's going to be really hard to help the kids feel safe if you yourself don't feel regulated and safe. So, can you talk a little
Yeah.
bit about the effect of raising kids who have challenging or big baffling behaviors that has on the caregiver?
In my work, I whittle everything down to regulation, connection, and felt safety. From a
Mm,
relational neuroscience perspective, there's a lot of overlap between those three things, but essentially when we're talking about the nervous system, then we're talking about the behaviors that come or emerge from the nervous system. You can really bring it all back to like that person's regulation experience, their experiencing connection to others or to themselves, and their experience and felt safety. And I typically, though not always, when I'm working with families, I'm initially talking about kids, right? That their behavior is because of their dysregulation or their
mhm.
um, experience in connection or lack of connection to themselves or to other folks, or their experience of felt safety. And there's always a moment. I talk so much about kids from the lens of they're doing the very, very best that they can. Regulated, connected kids who feel safe are doing well. We just have to get really curious about what's happening on the inside, right? That there is always this moment where parents are like, wait, I mean, if this applies to my kid, it's got to apply to me too. I'm like, yeah. And typically I wait for that moment because I've found if I try to help parents see that before they're really ready to see it, that
Mhm.
it doesn't land quite correctly. Sometimes it
Yeah,
lands as
there's like a
criticism.
self-protective wall comes up.
Exactly. Exactly. And
Yeah.
so, but, I talk so compassionately about kids and their behaviors that there's this moment where eventually parents are like, oh, this lady probably believes that about me too. And then the felt safety really kind of increases in our relationship. And we can start to look at a couple things. One is, how is this parenting experience impacting your sense of safety, your regulation, your stress response system? Like how have these experiences impacted your stress response system? In the same way we're looking at your kids' stress response system. But
Mhm.
also, how can we reframe the behaviors that you're having in response to your kids'
Mhm.
behaviors? Because so often those are just, completely consumed by feelings of shame or
Mhm.
defensiveness. Defensiveness is a beautiful protective mechanism against
Yes.
feeling shame. And when I can start to help families take everything they've learned about the nervous system and then apply it back towards themselves, like, no, this is why you're freaking out. This is why
Mhm.
you're asking, is there any way I can get out of this? Like, parenting was the worst idea I ever had. How do I make this stop? And like literally starting to make a plan for it.
Mhm.
And then, feel so ashamed about it later, or it's just all these places we find ourselves in as a parent of a kid whose needs are like, our society is not set up to care for these kids and families.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
instead of our society feeling shame about that, parents are feeling shame about that. What
Yes.
parents are feeling is, I am trying to exist inside a system that is literally designed for our failure,
Mhm.
and then being blamed for that failure,
Mhm.
which is traumatic.
Mhm.
That's traumatic. Not to mention, of course, what's actually happening in their homes and the intensity of the dysregulation, or the intensity of the helplessness, or the danger, like the literal danger that parents are
Mhm.
in sometimes. And then they ask for help and they're told to set better boundaries.
Thank you for speaking to that. I mean, I speak to it quite a bit,
Yeah.
knowing that I went through that and, just always
Yeah.
wondering when the next shoe was going to drop, or wondering if it was
Yeah.
safe to walk out of the room. I couldn't go to the grocery store, and just living in that constant fear of what was going to happen. But to hear someone else speak about it, I think it's really helpful and validating for parents who are listening to this to know that nothing is wrong with you if you are struggling
Right.
right now. I think that there's this big misconception and this kind of lie that we're told as parents, that if you're struggling as a parent, you somehow are a failure. Or if your kid is
Yeah.
struggling with, their behaviors, you somehow are a failure. And I think we
Right.
just need to, get rid of that concept, that idea that someone is failing because they're struggling. And so I love that you're sharing this. I think it's going to help a lot of parents who are listening to this. And I also know it's going to bring up a lot of questions. So my question is, what the heck do we do about this, Robyn? Like, how do we move forward? Okay, I get it. My kid is struggling. I'm struggling, but I don't want to keep struggling. So what are the steps out of this, like, unsustainable struggle?
That is the bajillion-dollar question, isn't it?
Right?
Yeah. So there's two, again, Liz, I kind of think about two paths here. And one is, and you know this, that sometimes there really are things that parents can learn, supports we can put in place, paradigm shifts we can make that really make a huge difference. For parents and for their kids, right? And so there's a very practical path of helping parents and other adults, educators, whoever it is, therapists, whoever it is in relationship with these kids. We have just learned, you and I assume, are approximately the same age. I mean, what we know about behavior and what it is drastically different than first of all, we learned when we were kids by the grown-ups parenting us.
Mhm.
But even like when I went to college and I was a young professional, like what we believed about behavior and the origins of behavior, and therefore what we do to change it, it's just leaps and bounds different than what we actually know now, right? In
Mhm.
2023, and the science. And there is, I think, a space, and I see parents who are kind of new to this way of seeing behaviors make huge strides in compassion for their kids and compassion for themselves. And I usually will say something like, finding tools that actually work. Like, I think one of the traumatic parts of this parenting is there's 9,866 billion parenting professionals,
Mhm.
and they all say something different.
So
And
frustrating.
so frustrating. It's maddening, and that's contributing to the shame, because it's like, this expert tells me if I do this, it should work, and my kids should be like this. So if it doesn't work,
Mhm.
clearly there's something wrong with me or something wrong with my kid. And then, oh, there's this new expert who tells me something different. Let me try that. We've totally ripped parents away from connecting with their own self and their own intuition. And I recognize the irony in that, and that I'm a professional who supports parents. I totally get this is very ironic. I'd like to think that what I do is help parents reconnect with themselves and
Mhm.
reconnect with their authentic child, instead of continuing to just like chuck spaghetti at the wall and play this endless terrible game of behavior whack-a-mole, because someone says, do this, try this, try this, try this, and we just we like get so disconnected from ourselves in
Mhm.
this game. And
Mhm.
so I have seen, and I know you have too, like seen just powerful, amazing shifts happen when we can help parents kind of decode behavior, determine like what it really is, what does it really mean, and therefore get some better guesses about how to help.
Mhm.
And so instead of going after behavior with consequences or punishments, and I'm looking at it like, how do we support this child's state of regulation, like now in this moment, as well as overall, like in their whole life, right?
Mhm.
How do we increase their connection to me as well as to themselves? How do we increase felt safety? Like, how can we look at what's happening in the home or what's happening at school? And that doesn't mean what's happening at home is bad or wrong, but
Mhm.
like parents aren't experts in the science of safety. I know a lot about the science of safety. So I try to like have us come together. Like, let
Mhm.
me tell you a little bit about what we understand about the science of safety. And then you apply it to like what's actually happening in your family and your kid and see if we can make some headway in calming that stress response system, right? Because if we can
What would
calm
be
that stress
one
response
example
system,
of, that felt safety and creating that in the home?
yeah. So many folks think felt safety is all about relationship. It's not. Felt safety is relationships one part of it, but we're getting cues of safety from our internal environment, from the external environment, and then yes, from the relationship. So I look at parents with like some real low hanging fruit of like, is your child dehydrated? I know that sounds ridiculous, but are they? Because dehydrated kids are more dysregulated. When was the last time they eat? What are they eating? What's the energy around food and feeding? Because so often, I mean, in 95% of my families, right? Like there's contentious energy around
Mhm.
food and feeding. Structure, routine, predictability. Pick your kid up from school with a snack in your hand. Go immediately to recess and get in some, or to the playground and get in some gross motor play. Let's kind of look at what your child is telling us about what their sensory system might
Mhm.
need. And so we're seeing these outrageous behaviors that even look like relational behaviors. They're like lying, they're talking back, they're snarky, but actually, what it is just a dysregulated nervous system. So, seriously, like, when was the last time they had a snack? When was the last time they moved their bodies? Like this really low hanging fruit. But also, yeah, I've learned so much more over the years about things like neuroimmune disorders, PANS, PANDAS, Lyme, and co-infections for Lyme. But even beyond that, like, is your kid tired? Like, do they have a sore
Mhm.
throat? Right? Like there are these internal experiences that are also negatively contributing to a sense of
Mhm.
felt safety. So we just try to look at like the lowest hanging fruit possible that can sound really obvious. But when you're parenting, right, in a state of kind of chronic chaos, you do
Mhm.
lose sight of some of these real kind of basic things, and a
Mhm.
little helpful reminder sometimes can go a long way.
I think that's why I asked, because I think that sometimes parents don't realize how there are these teeny tiny shifts that they can make in
Yeah.
their home. And
Yeah.
it's just going through that list of things that you just went through and saying, okay, are their basic needs met? What's going on sensory wise? Like, are they feeling like they are lacking a skill here? And so they don't feel like they can do the thing that you're asking them
Right.
to do. And so
Yep.
there's all these pieces we can look at that, yes, they live in a safe home. Yes, you are a loving parent, but there
Yes.
are all these other environmental things and other things that are going
Right.
on with their systems that they're internalizing, that they're not safe, and it's adding to
Right.
their dysregulation. And so by switching up just those small things like you just said, you can see drastic changes really quickly. The other thing that I notice, and I don't know what you see, but I notice just when parents pause and start noticing their own energy. So, for
For sure.
example, my son used to immediately be triggered if he assumed someone was angry. only if he assumed. He didn't
Yep.
actually, like, if there was any perception of danger to him,
Yep.
someone being angry, then he would lash out, and he would
Yeah.
lash out what seemed like out of nowhere. But once I started kind of pausing and paying attention, I noticed that on my tired days, he was more agitated and more grumpy, and he would lash out more. And it was because my voice actually changed. The tone
Yep.
of my voice was just like low and groggy, and my
Yep.
eyes would be like kind of shut. And so once
Yep.
I started noticing that, I was able to say, "Oh, hon, I'm really tired today. So if you notice
Yeah.
my voice being groggy, or if I don't answer you, it's because I didn't sleep well last night. I just need you to know that." And things would drastically change throughout the day. Now, I'm not saying this is a quick fix or it's going to
Right.
solve everyone's problems, but sometimes it's those little tiny
Yeah.
things that we don't even realize are happening because we are go, 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 trying to fix, trying to solve, and we're in this constant stress or chaos. So I love that you were bringing that up. It's really helpful.
Yes. And I know that for, again, some folks can feel like these little tiny things, like clearly you must not understand how bad my life is if you're suggesting these little teeny tiny things. And I get that. But also, once things get that out of control, like those are really the only things we can do are these little teeny tiny things. But
Mhm.
the other thing I do, I said, you asked, like, what do we do practically? And I was like, well, there's kind of two little buckets. There's a lot of practical things we can do to help families for sure. But also, it is true that there are kids who have needs and families who have needs that we are not equipped to help. Our culture's not equipped to help. Like the services that these families need literally don't exist. And if they do exist, they're inaccessible, right?
Mhm.
Maybe like they're too far away or they're too expensive or they require this time commitment that is just completely absurd if you do anything besides solely parent this child 24/7. And so I think that is a part of working with families whose kids are the most vulnerable is doing the work to grieve that
Mhm.
this is hard. Like the hard is like the most ridiculous word. It's not even hard. Like it's a word that doesn't even exist in the English language, right? And there is no one to help.
Mhm.
Nobody's
Mhm.
coming to fix this problem. And finding ways to be with that truth actually helps our nervous system feel better. It
Mhm.
feels, there's this sense of like, oh my gosh, that's going to leave me in hopelessness or helplessness. And I'm going to feel even worse. But there's actually a way that if we can just kind of come into, like, the science word would be like congruent with reality. Like, this is reality. Let's just acknowledge that it is true.
Mhm.
That actually strengthens our nervous system. So then we actually end up with more kind of capacity, like more space in our own window of tolerance to
Mhm.
deal with everything that's
Mhm.
terrible.
Because we're
Um,
no longer fighting against it. We're no longer saying,
exactly.
"Why is this so hard? Why I should be able to do this.
Right.
I should know what to do. I should be able to fix this."
Right.
And so once we stop and we say, "Okay, it is hard." And
Yeah.
hard, I agree, is like not a good enough word for this, but acknowledging, yeah, this sucks. This is not
Yeah.
fun. This is not how I would wish it to be. And feeling it. And when I say accept it, I don't mean like accept it and be like, get over it. I just mean like
Exactly.
accept that this is your current reality, and
Yeah.
and that you're the one in control of stepping forward. And it's going to be hard. There are going to be very hard days moving forward. It's not a quick fix. But when we think, and I think that's one of those, you talked about how there's 9,899, parenting experts out there. And I think that 9,890 of them are telling people that if you just do this one tip, if you just do this one
Right.
thing, and then when it doesn't work, you're like, "Oh, man, like, there
Right.
goes my hope." And it's like, "No, no,
Right.
no. Remember, it is hard. You're in the hard." And so it's not gonna be a quick fix. It's gonna be these teeny tiny tweaks along the
Yep.
way until you no longer recognize the hard you were in. So I love I think that's so important for parents to hear. I don't love that we have to talk about this or love that this is the tip, but I think it's important for parents who are in that really, really dark place to acknowledge to acknowledge where they are and then say, okay, here's where I'm at. I'm going to feel those feels. And then, like you said, it builds capacity, it builds your resilience. So you can take one tiny step. You can
Yeah.
tweak one little thing and keep moving forward.
One thing that I think is so devastating about living in the frankly richest country in the world is that we are perpetually asking our most vulnerable to make the biggest change with the least amount of support. And so
100%.
that's obviously happening with our kids, right? I mean, it's happening at school. The things that our school is asking our kids to do, it's like, why don't you make these other kids change? Like the other kids have a lot of resilience. They're the ones that could like make big changes and be okay. Like change them so that my kid doesn't, but that's also true about parents, right? Like we're like these are our most vulnerable families, our most vulnerable kids, our most vulnerable parents, and we are doing the least to support them while simultaneously asking them to be the ones who are making the biggest changes. And I think naming that again brings us into like reality. Like, of course, this is madness. Of course, I feel this way. Of course, nothing is getting better at my house because people are asking me to do something different while giving me zero help to actually do it, which I realize is not the same as actually giving you help. I wish I could go to all these families' homes and give them practical boots on the ground help. I can't do that. But I think recognizing the absurdity of how we're continually asking the most vulnerable folks to be the ones making the biggest changes kind of does bring this breath of like, oh, that's insane.
That's why this is hard. So I'm not making this up. This is why this is hard. I think absolutely that is so helpful for people to hear that and to know that it's okay for it to be hard and that they're not imagining things. I think sometimes we feel like we're imagining it when it's just so darn hard and we feel like we're the only ones. So even just hearing you say that there are others going through this can be really helpful. So what, something I love asking all of our guests is, and I know that you've done some of this with us before, we've had our Expert Secret series, but if you were sitting with one of these parents or with one of the kids and you could speak just for 1 to 2 minutes and they could only get one thing from you and nothing else, what is the one thing that you hope they get from this chat or one thing that they hear as they go forward today?
Even though this doesn't feel like practical information at all, I actually think the most important thing we do when parenting kids with this level of vulnerability is believe in our core and help them believe as well that there's nothing wrong with them, that all behavior makes perfect sense. When I lean into my training as a play therapist, nothing was more important than crossing the hurdle of there is nothing wrong with me. I can actually even build a relationship with the parts of me that are holding these hardest behaviors. And actually, that is crucial. That is 100% crucial in having any kind of shift or change happen in the nervous system. And we can't do that until there is a sense of all these behaviors make sense and I'm going to think about them with some curiosity instead of some shame. Now, little kids aren't sitting there going, oh, let me be curious about these parts of myself. That's not how it works at all. But kids are doing this in other ways through their play and just through like the way they think in metaphor, the way they do. I mean, there's just lots of different ways a child's brain is doing this act of being with themselves and believing that all behavior makes sense. Now, that doesn't mean all behavior is okay. not in any way, shape, or form. But kids believe that because the grown-ups believe that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I know that's not a very practical tool, but it is the most important thing.
I love that. Now, Robyn, you have got this amazing book, Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors, and you have got a podcast and you've got courses and all sorts of amazing resources. Can you tell listeners where to find you, where to find out more so that they can follow along? Because like I said, peanut butter and jelly, guys, you need both of these books. They go hand in hand. Robyn is absolutely phenomenal, and I hope that you guys will all go check her out. So Robyn, tell everyone where to go check you out.
The easiest place to find me is just on my website, which is just robyngobbel.com. And from there, you can find my podcast, which you could, of course, just search for in your podcast app, the Baffling Behavior Show. The book, Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors, is anywhere that you would buy a book. And then I do have a tab on my website that is called, it's free resources. And it is exactly that. It is just scads of downloadable, free ebooks, webinars, infographics, things you could give to, a partner who's struggling to kind of come along, or to a teacher. So I work really hard to make so much stuff free and easily accessible, and you can get to it all over on my website.
That's wonderful. And we will link that in the show notes. So be sure to go to calmthechaospodcast.com so you guys can grab all of those amazing resources that Robyn has for you and grab a copy of her book. Now, we are big on taking a next step here at Calm the Chaos. And I would love, if you are listening to this, if you would just shoot Robyn or myself or both of us a little message and let us know what is the one thing that you're taking away from this chat. And this does two things. One, it lets us know what resonates with you. And two, it lets you know that you're not alone, because we will be right there with you, and you'll know you're not going through this journey all on your own. You've got me, you've got Robyn, you've got our communities behind you to support you. So as Robyn has shared, it's so important that you walk away knowing that there is no part of you that is broken. There is no part of your child that is broken. You are not failing. You're exactly the parent your child needs. And so I look forward to talking to all of you on next week's podcast. See you next week.